All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today we're exploring a specific slice of history that literally reshaped the entire modern world. We're going to unpack the profound, devastating impact of World War I on Russia, and we'll trace the surprising, true origins of the 20th century's most brutal regimes. Now, when we think of the great dictatorships of the past century, we often jump straight into the middle of the story, right? But to truly understand how these massive systems of total control were built, we need to go back to the original blueprint. And as you'll see, that blueprint was drafted much earlier than a lot of us were taught. So, this brings us to a really fascinating question, one that challenges a huge historical myth. For decades now, there's been this persistent narrative that Vladimir Lenin was basically a well-intentioned idealist, the good communist, whose noble revolution was just hijacked and corrupted later on by Joseph Stalin. It's a super compelling story for sure, because it separates the original ideas of the Russian Revolution from the absolutely horrific violence that came after. But we have to ask ourselves, does the actual historical record support this? To see exactly where that myth took root, we just have to look at Nikita Khrushchev in 1956. In a massive landmark speech, he asked his fellow party members this exact question. By framing the issue this way, Khrushchev basically cemented the fable of the good Lenin. It was a highly deliberate narrative strategy meant to completely distance and save the core idea of communism from the glaring, undeniable evils of Stalin's rule. The logic was, if Stalin was just a terrible aberration, then Leninism itself could remain pure and untouched. But what's the actual reality here? Well, to find out, we're reporting directly on the findings from historian Robert Gilately's incredible book, Lenin, Stalin, and Hitler, The Age of Social Catastrophe. Gilately dives deep into Russian archives, documents that were literally locked away for decades to systematically dismantle this entire myth. And the best part is, he does it without taking political sides. He's simply following the newly available evidence to show us exactly how the foundational bricks of state terror were laid. Section 1. The Catalyst, World War I and the Fall of the Old Order. Before we can even wrap our heads around the fateful year of 1917, we absolutely have to look at the immense, crushing pressures that broke the Russian Empire. It was this war monster that truly paved the way for radical utopians to seize power. 13 million. Just think about that number for a second. That represents the staggering human devastation of World War I in Russia. The war brought catastrophic losses, with approximately 8 million soldiers killed or permanently disabled, and roughly 5 million civilians lost to things like disease and malnutrition. It was a societal trauma on an unimaginable scale. The Russian people were pushed to their absolute breaking point, and that immense suffering set the perfect stage for a total systemic collapse. Section 2. The Brief Democratic Window. Russia's Missed Opportunity in 1917. So out of all that immense wartime suffering came a massive revolution that effectively ended a 300-year-old monarchy. But wait, it wasn't initially the Bolshevik Revolution that we all know about today. Just look at the chaotic density of events in 1917. In a matter of months, a genuinely democratic spring, in February, where the Tsar actually abdicated and a provisional government formed, was systematically torn apart by the end of that very same year. It is an unbelievably rapid transition from newfound liberation to a completely new form of authoritarian control. After the Romanov dynasty fell in February, the new provisional government took over, and for a brief, fleeting moment, it turned Russia into an incredibly free nation. Lenin himself even admitted it was the freest of all the belligerent countries in the world. But here's the wild part. Lenin absolutely hated this. To him, a functional, liberal democracy was a massive threat to his radical goals, simply because it pacified the masses and stalled the transition to a purely socialist state. Section 3. The Vanguard arrives. Lenin's return and the rejection of democracy. When Lenin finally made it back to Petrograd from Switzerland, and keep in mind, his trip was heavily funded by German authorities who fully wanted him to disrupt this fragile new democracy and pull Russia out of the war, he completely shocked everyone. Even his fellow revolutionaries were stunned by his April theses. His strategy was entirely uncompromising. He demanded an immediate transition to socialism, brushing off the idea of a parliamentary republic as a retrograde step. Instead, he brilliantly and rather cynically deployed populist slogans like peace, land, and bread to mask his ultimate rigid goal, building a one-party state run by professional revolutionaries. And this sets up a genuinely chilling comparison between these emerging 20th century regimes. If we look at the right side first, Hitler sought this terrifying consensus dictatorship, He relied heavily on popularity, carefully preparing public opinion to build a racially exclusive bond. But over on the left, we see Lenin's model, a vanguard dictatorship. Lenin and later Stalin constructed a system where an elite vanguard ruled the masses strictly through force. They never retreated in the face of opposition, and they relied immediately on ruthless terror rather than trying to build any sort of popular consensus. Section 4. The October Coup, a strategic takeover, not a popular uprising. The real climax of this whole chronological drama hits in October 1917. This is when Lenin relentlessly bullied his own hesitant Central Committee into seizing power. And it wasn't some spontaneous, grassroots eruption of the masses. It was a highly calculated, violently strategic coup. Despite what later Soviet myths would have you believe about massive, romanticized uprisings storming the Winter Palace, the reality was starkly different. Only about 25,000 to 30,000 insurgents were actually involved. To put that into perspective, that is roughly 5% of Petrograd's workers and soldiers. Just 5%. But that small fraction was all that was needed to quietly seize control of the city's key infrastructure, like railway stations and telephone exchanges. Section 5. Dismantling the democracy. The end of civil liberties. Okay, so once they're in power, the Bolsheviks hit an immediate wall. They realize they simply do not have majority support across the vast, diverse Russian nation. So what do? Well, instead of building a broader coalition, they immediately start tearing down the brand new democratic institutions. When nationwide free elections for the Constituent Assembly were finally held in November, the Bolsheviks lost, and they lost terribly. They captured only 24% of the vote. Meanwhile, the peasant-backed social revolutionaries won a clear plurality with 40%. The fact is, the people did not choose Lenin's vanguard. They chose land reform and democratic socialism. When other socialist factions understandably protested this blatant disregard for the democratic process, Leon Trotsky delivered this incredibly dramatic, completely chilling dismissal. By literally condemning them to the garbage heap of history, Trotsky and the Bolshevik leadership sent a crystal-clear signal. The era of political cooperation and pluralism was officially over. From that moment on, if you weren't with the vanguard, you were an enemy of the state. And if you want to completely dismantle the good Lenin myth, just look at his own words. He proves right here that he viewed massive violence and dictatorship not as some unfortunate accident forced on him by circumstance, but as an absolutely foundational, necessary tool required to smash the old state. For Lenin, dictatorship was literally defined as a state of simmering war against his own people. Section 6. The Blueprint for Terror. Institutionalizing repression. Lenin didn't just talk a big game about violence theoretically, he immediately built the actual physical machine to enforce it, proving his undeniable role in the centuries coming catastrophes. Less than 2 months after taking power, he drove the creation of the Cheka. This was a secret police force explicitly designed to ruthlessly suppress all opposition, operating completely outside the boundaries of any legal rights or courts. It was the massive institutionalization of terror, tasked with crushing strikes, eliminating political rivals, and targeting entire classes of people simply for who they were, not for anything they had actually done. And to keep this incredibly fragile grip on power, Lenin actually made some staggering international concessions. He signed the disastrous Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, willingly handing over massive chunks of Russian territory and tens of millions of citizens to Germany. He did this just to end the external war. Also, he could focus the full, terrifying might of his new regime on his internal enemies. Let's just slow down for a second and look at this chilling directive from August 1918. Here, we clearly see the true reality of Lenin's leadership. He is actively commanding the merciless suppression of everyday ordinary peasants, the kulaks, who dared to resist. By insisting that one must give an example, Lenin firmly established the uncompromising standard of state-sponsored terror that Joseph Stalin would later emulate and expand upon to such horrific effect. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. If the actual blueprint for systemic terror, secret police, and the total destruction of civil liberties was firmly drawn up by Lenin in 1917, how does that shift how we view the decades that followed? I invite you to rethink the historical narratives we've so often been taught and really recognize how quickly a fragile democracy can be dismantled when absolute power is prioritized over the will of the people. Thanks for exploring this with us today.